everybody. Welcome to Becoming a Bible Nerd. We are on chapter 10 in the book of John. Last week we left off in chapter 9 where Jesus heals a blind man and the religious leaders go crazy, and the whole theme of that chapter was their spiritual blindness. And so in their original ancient text there was no break. There wasn't a chapter break between 9 and 10. This is a continuation. I told you last week this is a to be continued. So in the midst of all of this argument and debate, Jesus goes into one of the greatest illustrations to me in the entire Bible to show these blind leaders what a good shepherd or a good leader looks like and what false leaders or bad leaders look like. And so he goes into this teaching using the illustration of a good shepherd. Now, Jesus is taking something that is extremely common to these people. They know shepherding. Most of them have been shepherds, or they have lived around shepherds, or their ancestors were shepherds. This is so common because their entire system for the removal of sins center around the slaughtering, the sacrifice of a lamb. And so there's shepherds everywhere, and shepherds have existed for thousands of years. In fact, their greatest ancestors were shepherds. Abraham was a shepherd. Moses was a shepherd. King David was a shepherd. And so the Old Testament is has very many examples of this, and it was a natural image of a metaphor for these rulers to be called shepherds. So in the Old Testament, God is mentioned as Israel's shepherd, and the same thing as the kings and the leaders, any kind of political leader or religious leader that was doing well would be called a good shepherd. And just the opposite, when Israel had bad kings or bad leaders, they were called bad shepherds. And so this is something very, very common. But to us, we don't really know anything about shepherding unless you happen to probably live in the Middle East. In fact, one of my best friends in college, she was from Arizona, and her family had sheep. That's what they did, but they were ranchers, and that is very different, and we'll get to that later. And so we could go into this reading and just get maybe a tiny percent of, oh, okay, well, that sounds good, and move on and just dismiss it. But there was so much richness in this. So today we're going to dive deep in what the life of a shepherd looked like. And I'm going to share with you some really good stories from this, because I have a book where a man spent some time researching shepherds and lived among Bedouin people in the Middle East. And this book just has so many good stories that I wanted to share them with you. So we're going to have some fun today. I really love this topic. It's near and dear to my heart, but more than anything, I think it's one of the best illustrations, because I don't really know anything on earth that pictures Jesus's love for us as individuals like a shepherd and his fold. So we're going to get started in chapter 1. And I'm going to do a lot of reading. We're going to just break this down. So verse 1 says, I assure you, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the door, but climbs in some other way, is a thief and a robber. Okay, right off the bat, that does not mean anything to us. But in the ancient world, there would be a pasture, and they would usually have a sheep pen that would be butt up against some sort of cliff or wall or side of a mountain, and they would take stones and they would build a pen. And so something in nature would be the back of it, and they would build the walls up, usually about 4 feet high, with stone, and they would leave one opening for the sheep to enter into so that they could stay there safely for the night. It would be a place where they could be protected and safe in the night. And they would usually put some kind of thorn on top of the stone, and this would help against animals or thieves or robbers to take away from the sheep. Also, there would be several different flocks that could stay there. I mean, this was not just one person owned it. It would be out there for many people to use, and neighboring shepherds would use it to hold their sheep. And we're going to talk about how you would get your sheep out and not take anyone else's sheep, and that's going to be part of this story and very interesting. Also, the last thing that we need to know is this one doorway would be called the sheep gate, and either the shepherd would lay there and sleep there, or they would hire someone to do that. And either the shepherd or the hired gatekeeper would not let anyone in who was not a shepherd of the flock. And so again, that was there for protection. And so he is saying that if you don't go in through the door, if you go in to get the sheep any other way, then you're a thief or a robber. And the entire rest of this section that we're going to tear apart is comparing these religious leaders, these Pharisees and the Sadducees, as thieves and robbers, because they are taking God's sheep and they are leading them astray. But they're not really going to catch on to what he's saying. So the next section that we're going to tear apart, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to back up. I am going to read what God says through the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 34, verses 2 through 4. This is Ezekiel 34, 2 through 4. It says, "Woe to the shepherds of Israel who only take care of themselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you don't take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, healed the sick, or bound the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost." So what Jesus is communicating in John chapter 10, and God is warning in Ezekiel 34, is that these religious leaders are using the flock for their own needs. He's talking about the children of Israel, but they're getting things out of them like money and they're ruling over them for their own benefit. But a shepherd was someone who loved their sheep, who led their sheep well and took care of them in endless ways. It was crazy, the relationship that the shepherd would have with each individual sheep. And so he is telling these religious leaders in Ezekiel that you're not strengthening the weak ones, you're not healing the sick ones, you're not bounding up the injured ones, you're not going out and risking your life to look for strays or searching for the lost. You're only getting the wool and getting the curds and using it for your own benefit. And just in this book that I have about shepherding, years ago, I think about 2 years ago, I was going through this. I wrote out to the side, am I doing this? Am I using my time and energy to do these positive things that a good shepherd would do for the people that they love? And so through this, we need to understand how much a shepherd loves and tends and takes care of his sheep. And through some of these stories I'm going to share with you, we'll see that. So moving on to verses 2 through 5, it says, "The one who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. The doorkeeper or gatekeeper opens it for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought all of his sheep outside, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they recognize his voice. They will never follow a stranger. Instead, they will run away of him because they don't recognize the stranger's voice." So many cool things are happening here. So as there was a gatekeeper and a shepherd would come up just to get his particular flock out, the gatekeeper would let him in because he had authority to go through the gate. But then how he would get only his sheep out is he would either play a tune or just use his voice to call them, and all of his sheep that he owned would look up and recognize that he was their shepherd. They wouldn't respond if another shepherd came, but they would look up and respond to him. They knew his voice, they knew the tone of his music tune, and then he started calling them each by name. Every sheep in a flock would have their own name, and it was usually characteristic of something about their personality or their look. And so he's calling their names and they call out. But here, remember I said I had a friend that worked in the sheep industry on a farm in Arizona. They were ranchers. What do ranchers do? They get dogs and horses and they drive the sheep somewhere. But shepherds in the Middle East lead their sheep. They start walking and their sheep follow. And this is such an amazing thing. And it says if a stranger comes up, sheep aren't going to naturally go astray. They want to stay with the one that loves them and knows them and has spent time with them. They don't respond to strangers. And so we're going to look at an example of this. Let me turn to the right page. And this is just interviews that this man did with different shepherds in the Middle East. And this is one of the conversations he's having with one of the Bedouin shepherds. This man says, "Since 1984, I have never lost a sheep or a goat that I didn't find again, dead or alive. But then with hesitation and obvious feeling, he continues, except for one. That one I'll never forget. She's on my mind every night before I sleep. Although he had thousands of animals, he felt shame as a shepherd that he could not account for that lost one. And even as I read this, I get choked up because of the love that shepherds have for their sheep. And Jesus is saying this is a picture of how God feels for us. We're not just in general children that he created on planet Earth, but he knows us each by name, and he puts certain personality and characteristics and skills and purpose in each one of our lives for his purpose and for his kingdom. And this shepherd is weeping over a lost sheep that he had years ago. And another story that I wanted to share with you was about a shepherdess. There in the Middle East, women and men could be shepherds. And it says, Mrs. Aroff lost track of one of her ewes. And I'm going to kind of skip around because the story was long. But none of them had seen the missing creature, talking about her friends and family. Then one day, 2 months later, a large flock came through the village led by a hired shepherd. And as still was her habit, Mrs. Aroff asked the young man if he had come across the lost sheep. As her words passed through her lips, one of the ewes in the solid pack of passing sheep lifted her head, immediately recognizing the sound of her owner's voice. And then I love what happens next. Mrs. Aroff screamed with delight and rushed through the startled mass and embraced her lost sheep. It didn't take long before the whole village heard the commotion and shared in the reunion. Her flock was now complete again. I love this because not only did she rejoice when she found her lost sheep 2 months later and the sheep recognized her, but the entire town joined in this because this is how precious and how valuable sheep are to shepherds. And then it says there's one final story from a Syrian shepherd, and it ends happy. A couple of brothers searched through the night till they discovered the trail of their 2 missing sheep. When they came back to their village, their father was calling them. Have you found them? The answer we sent back to him, saved, both saved, was enough to fill the little house with great rejoicing. Rejoicing, did I say? Every member of our house asked us to tell that story again and again of how our lost sheep was sought for, found, and saved. So this was something that through the years they would retell, and the kids would say, tell us that story again, because it was so precious to them. Moving on to verses 6 through 10. Jesus gives an illustration to them, but they do not understand what he's telling. Remember, this is the religious leaders he's talking to. Verse 7, so Jesus says again, I assure you, I am the sheep gate. This is the third I am statement found in the book of John. Remember, the first one was in chapter 6 where he says, I am the bread of life, shortly after he feeds them with loaves of bread and fish. The second instance was whenever he was in the temple during the Festival of Tabernacles, and he says, I am the light of the world. In chapter 8, when they lit the 75-foot high menorahs. This is the third example. He's talking to the religious leaders, and he says, I am the sheep gate. All who come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep didn't listen to them. I am the gate. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will come and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy, but I have come that they might have life and have it in abundance. If the sheep enter, or if the shepherds enter through the gate, which is Jesus. You have to go through Jesus to have right relationship with God. And he says, if you do this, you will have life and have it in abundance. Now, the American way would tell you that that's going to be all your hopes and dreams come true, and all the money in the world, anything that you would ever want would come true. And we know that produces entitled, spoiled people. That is not the abundant life that Jesus is talking about. The abundant life is one, well, first it's eternal life, that we get to spend time with God for all eternity in absolute perfection, just like he intended in the Garden of Eden. But here on earth, we can have peace. Even in the midst of trials and storm, we can have an inner peace through that he promises through this relationship with him. We can also have contentment. There was a time that I was in Israel and we were going through the desert, taking a hike. It was over 100 degrees and it was desolate and it was in the middle of nowhere. And I remember through the journey, about 2 hours in, we sat down and our guide asked us what we're thankful for. It was hot. There was nothing in sight. And as we sat down, I was so moved by people's responses. Every now and then you would get a slight breeze. And that was something that had not everything been stripped for us, we wouldn't have even noticed. Every now and then there would be like a little cloud covering. And so you would feel a little bit of the shade instead of the blistering hot. We had camelbacks on our backs, so we were so thankful for the water that we had. And it was just the absolute most simple things that people were so grateful for. And that is, whenever we start following the Lord, we live a life of contentment. And these are things that can bring that abundant life. And so we're going to pick up and go through verses 11 through 16. This is the I am statement number 4. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. Now, this is going to be something that he says over and over and over again throughout the rest of this text and this chapter. And he is giving them a clue that one day he will lay down his life and sacrifice himself for the people willingly. This will not be something that is forced upon him, but something that he has chosen to do and that he is willing to do. And so he is beginning to share this truth with these people, but we get the pleasure of reading this hindsight. They don't know what he's talking about in the time. He ends up saying that the hired man, since he is not the shepherd and doesn't own the sheep, leaves them and runs when he sees a wolf coming. So what would happen is, and we know this from King David, we know this from studying other shepherds, is that when danger came, a lion or a bear or a wolf or something, that the shepherd would stay and fight off these enemies even unto death. They weren't necessarily, these other shepherds weren't necessarily willing to lay down their life, but they wouldn't leave the flock and they would fight. And sometimes these animals would end up attacking them and killing them. And they would stay with their flock because they loved them and they were valued by them. But sometimes the flock got so big that shepherds would have to hire other people. And Jesus is saying that the hired people run when life gets hard and when it's dangerous. They are going to run and save themselves because they don't have that intimacy. They don't have that love relationship with the sheep. The sheep aren't theirs. They are just doing it as a means for money, and they will run away. The wolf then snatches and scatters. This happens because the hired man doesn't care about the sheep. Just exactly what the Pharisees and the Sadducees were. But Jesus goes on to say, I am the good shepherd. I know my own sheep and they know me, as the Father knows me and I know the Father. I lay down my life for the sheep. But I have other sheep that are not in this fold, and I must bring them also, and they also will listen to my voice. Then there will be one flock and one shepherd. At the end, it's believed he's talking about two different things. In the time of the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire, the children of Israel were scattered throughout. Some of the children ended up returning to Israel, but not all of them. A lot of the Israelites were still scattered, and they are to this day. And Jesus says that there will be a gathering before he comes back. But we also believe that he's talking about Gentiles here. In the Jewish mind, that the Messiah was only coming for his chosen people. But throughout the entire Gospels, God is warning them and giving them clues that he didn't only come for them, but he came for the entire world. And he will start gathering up the Gentiles and mixing them into the fold, and we will get to be part of his family. I'm going to share with you another story. And this is a Bedouin shepherd named Said, and he's from the Sinai. And it says that this happened by the age of 7. He had 30 goats that he was in charge of for daily feeding. And one day he returned at dusk with one missing goat. Said had been distracted by the attention of a shepherd girl from another flock. Whenever he got home, his dad said, "Go out and don't come home without it." Even though the goat had made its way back home by itself the next morning, Said's father didn't call his son. See, he needed to learn this lesson that the shepherd never came home without the sheep. And so the sheep know their master's voice, and their master, their shepherd, knows every sheep individually. See, every night as the sheep would go into the pen, the shepherd would put their rod up, and they would have to feel that their sheep would go under their rod, and this would also slow each individual sheep down so the shepherd could feel the sheep to make sure that there were no bugs on it, or if they weren't injured, or they didn't have any cuts. And so there was so much more to this relationship than them just naming them, just recognizing them by sight. But shepherds would know what each individual sheep would even feel like. And at times, I shared something on Bible Nerds months ago about a sheep that had been rejected by its mother, and therefore would be rejected by the whole flock, and how the shepherd would take them in at night, let them hear their heartbeat, and that individual ewe would be known and loved by the shepherd intimately, and then because of that it would be able to go into the flock. It was such a beautiful story. Again, this is such a picture of how Jesus loves each and every one of us individually and is concerned about us. And so the last section in this Good Shepherd talk is verse 17 through 21, and it says, "This is why the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it up again." He's talking about his death and resurrection, but of course they don't understand. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own. I have the right to lay it down, and I have the right to take it up. I've received this command from my Father. Again, a division took place among the Jews because of these words, and many of them were saying, "He has a demon and he's crazy. Why do we listen to him?" Others were saying, "These aren't words of someone demon-possessed. Can a demon-possessed open the eyes of the blind?" And so people are struggling with where truth is. And I want to lead this with one last story on how a shepherd knows his sheep. And I think this is such a beautiful one. This is talking about a young boy. There's actually 3 brothers that were shepherds, but it says, once you begin to fathom how many times an animal has been counted, checked, carried, nursed back to health, rescued, protected, milked, and shorn, it dawns on you why the Bedouin says that sheep are family. So in this particular fold, the mothers, and I think there were about 51 of them altogether, were kept back from their lambs. But then the boys, the shepherd boys, are going to begin to join the lambs with their babies. And they begin to call each one by name. And as each one was allowed to come, Nisr, the little boy shepherd, slipped the noose off of the young one's neck and gave it to the mother. He knew every mother and every lamb. An astonishing thing was that he called up each ewe and picked her out in complete darkness. Although the process of loosing the lambs, calling up the mothers, and handing the baby to the baby to the mom to nurse, he was calling out the names in the midst of a den of mothers, in the midst of baying and lamb crying for their food. To me, it was pandemonium. To him, it was just everyday procedure. He could recognize each mother and each baby by the feel with his eyes shut. All were black, and remember it was dark, but by feeling the heads and the backs, he knew by touch which one was which. And I just think that this is so fascinating. There's more and more of these stories that I could share, and it just goes to show how much our Heavenly Father is a good shepherd. He loves us. He knows us by name. We are important, and when we wander off, and metaphorically, what he's saying is, like, when we sin, when we go away from him, he will stop. He will get a hired hand to look for all the sheep that are accounted for, and he will go out and search for us. And if we are injured, he will carry us back and he will nurse us to health until we can join the flock. It's not anything to do with shame or, oh, well, that they should have known better, but he will take care of us because he knows that sometimes we can be dumb and wander away and get so easily distracted. This entire scene wraps up here. It's not the end of the chapter. It goes on to verse 22, but about 2 months have passed because this next section is during Hanukkah. But for some reason, John thought that this would be a perfect mirror image of what was going on. And at Hanukkah, we see that people just flat out ask, "Are you the Messiah?" And he ends up responding and says, "You wouldn't believe me. You're not my sheep. You can look at the work that I do, that you can see I do it in my Father's name, that my sheep are listening to my voice and I know them and they follow me, but you won't believe. And he goes again and reminds them if those that follow him will have eternal life and that no one can snatch them away. So as we're closing today, I want to tackle the question, what does it mean to hear and know our shepherd's voice? Well, one thing is it's going to require time. The shepherd and the sheep spent an unbelievable amount of time together. And this is what it's going to require. It does require time. And in our busy world, it seems that we don't feel like we have accomplished the day unless we have spent every second filling it up with something. We do this because we want to feel like we've accomplished something. We want to find meaning. We want to find purpose. But God is just wanting to spend time with us. And a lot of times our busyness can take away any extra time that we have to just sit and be still in his presence. And if you are saying today, you know what, I don't have time for any of this, then that is a clue that you've busied your life with too much. Jesus wants to spend time with us, and to hear and to know his voice is going to require time. It's going to require listening, sitting still in silence. Whenever you go to God with your prayers, is it just a quick, hey God, I don't have a lot of time? I know that we don't really say that, but is that the posture of our heart? Hey, Carrie here, don't have a lot of time, so just listen up real quick. If you can do A, B, C, D, E, F, G in my life, because you know what? I haven't really had enough time to invest in those. And so if you could just send your supernatural power to make it awesome, that'd be great. Okay, have a great day. Is that what our prayer life looks like? Are we just sitting and listening, waiting to hear the voice of God? Are we waking up in the morning, sitting in his presence with our coffee and our worship and saying, after the model prayer that Jesus said, God, you are so worthy of all our praise, and I want your kingdom to come. So what will you have of me today, Lord? What open doors? What do you want me to do? What can I do to serve you today? And then just sit and listen and worship. God is always speaking, but we don't always hear. Not the last thing, but the last thing that I am going to address is we have to read his word. We have to meditate on it. Whenever I study a chapter, I go through it piece by piece. I'm asking God to show me things. I'm researching, I'm doing things. And it takes me about a week to go through one chapter. But then on Monday morning before we film, I have 2 hours where after meditating on it all week, I go through it one more time and I say, okay, God, put this all together. Show me something. And every week, it never fails that something new jumps out at me, and it just does something in my spirit. And during that week, it's not always easy. Sometimes I'm reading and I'm just like, I'm not getting this. This is not soaking in. This is going over my head. But as I meditate on it, as I return back to it, as I spend time, as I sit in silence, God is always so good to show me something new. And the second thing I want to tackle is, what does his voice sound like? One, it's going to always sound like his word. In fact, we have to test everything with his word, because sometimes we can hear voices and they're not his, but we can always return to the word to make sure that it is his voice or not. Another way to recognize his voice is when a thought pops up in your head and it's asking you to move out of your comfort zone, to love someone more, to be bolder than you've ever been, or to be more selfless than you've ever been. All of these things are from the heart of God, and usually we can know that that's him speaking to us. So as we close, I want you to ask, what changes need to take place in your life so that you can better hear the voice of God? What things do you need to maybe cut out so that you have more time? What discipline do you need to take care of so that you can sit in silence and hear God's voice and spend time in his word? I know that this went a little long, but I have so much fun with studying shepherds and talking about them. He really is the good shepherd. We will hit chapter 11 next week. It's the death and resurrection of Jesus' good friend Lazarus. I can't wait to unpack that with you. I'll see you next week. Happy reading.